In this lecture, we're going to continue to look at fault tolerance, redundancy, and resiliency. And now we look at RAID. Really, when we build any system, we want as high as possible uptime and system and hardware redundancy, especially on critical devices. And as part of that, we use RAID. Whenever I have talked to colleagues, they either refer to it as redundant array of independent disks, but I have seen it mentioned elsewhere as inexpensive disks. Now, how we would know they are inexpensive, I have no clue. We do, however, know that they are independent. And RAID comes in two basic forms: disk mirroring and disk striping. And disk mirroring really makes sense. We have a mirror of that disk. We write the same data to disk A and to disk B. They are exact copies. If disk A fails, well then we have everything on B. The image over here on the right at the top, that is disk mirroring. But this also makes it slower because the RAID controller have to write the same data twice. And you can technically put as many disks in a mirror as you want, but at the minimum we need 2. You could write the same data to 10 disks. I don't really know of any use cases for it, and I have never worked anywhere where we did it, but it is possible. If we use 2 disks, well then we use twice the storage space. If we use 10, then 10 times. And then next up, disk striping. And that is us writing the data across multiple disks. For disk striping, we also need at least 2 disks, and it does in itself not provide any redundancy. If you look at the graphics at the bottom right, you can see that the data is written to 3 disks. If disk C fails, well then we lose all the data on that disk, and we're probably not going to be able to restore. What we do get out of this is that it writes much faster. And while it's nice that it writes faster, we really want that resiliency, that redundancy. So to get that, we use parity with our striping. That gives us that resiliency, and we often get it just by using XORing. We need at least 3 disks. So instead of the data like you have on the bottom right here would be A1, A2, A3, then it would be A1, A2, and then on the third disk, it would be the parity. And parity really just is a checksum that we can use to restore the data on the disk we lose. And it can be either we have a specific disk just for the parity. In most cases, I've seen we spread it out. So in the A row, disk C would be the parity. In the B row, it might be disk A. In the C row, it might be disk D. Now, if disk A fails, well then we can, with the checksums we have on the parity, restore whatever was on disk A. And as I mentioned, at least 3 disks, but normally we use more. Now, let's look at some of the different types of RAIDs that you might see in your environment or on the exam. And we start out with RAID 0. And RAID 0 is striping with no parity. There is no fault tolerance. The first graphics over here on the right is RAID 0. You can see A1, A2, B1, B2. The data is just spread across those 2 disks. If one disk fails, well then all the data is lost. And the only thing we get out of this is really faster write speeds, and for RAID 0, we need at least 2 disks. We can use more. RAID 1 is the mirroring we talked about before. We write identical data to 2 or more disks. This obviously gives us the redundancy we would want, but it also makes it much slower. In the business world, I don't think I've ever seen RAID 0 or 1 used. What I've seen used very commonly is RAID 5. And we have sort of talked about RAID 5 already. That's the one where we have the disk striping with distributed parity. And it's called distributed because the parity is distributed across the disks. We need at least 3 disks. In my example over here on the right, I have 4. And this is a good combination and probably why it is used so much. We get increased read and write speeds, but we also get that redundancy. Most of the systems I have seen this used on were not critical systems because we only have a single disk fault tolerance, and we might want more if it is a critical system, or at least have some sort of other redundancies in place to ensure that we don't really have any downtime. Because with RAID 5, we are protected against data loss if a single disk fails, but if more than 1 disk fails, we are just as lost as we would have been if we did not have any redundancy. Which also means as soon as we realize a disk has failed or we get a predictive failure on that server, we replace the disk right away. And for me at least, the 2 disks failing is a hypothetical. I have never worked anywhere where a second disk failed before we could replace the first one that failed. But just because I haven't experienced it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, and it certainly doesn't mean it's not something we should be aware of and act on right away. So normally if we buy a physical server, that means that most likely all the disks were built at the same time, and the MTBF, or the mean time between failure, would be the same. Let's just say, as an example, the mean time between failure for the disks over here on the right is 3 years. And the server that they're in is in a large data center or a place where we have critical servers, so we have some sort of service level agreement, either with the vendor that built the system or someone we have contracted this out to. As part of that service level agreement, we would have an MTTR, mean time to repair, from the time we notify them by either calling or the monitor system tells them something is failing. They could have 4 or 12 or 24 hours for someone to be on site with a replacement disk. In one of the data centers that I worked in, we had a pretty aggressive agreement. Within 4 hours, a tech had to be on site, but they didn't always have the disks that they needed for our data center. And I remember one incident where the technician was there at 3 hours and 59 minutes. He technically was there before the 4 hours had passed, but he also told me he spent an hour and a half waiting in an airport for the disk to get flown in. In most cases though, and for the most common servers, and definitely for the critical ones, we would have disks on hand so we can replace them as soon as we see either a failure or a predictive failure. And a predictive failure is just the system saying it's very likely that this disk will fail in the foreseeable future. We then replace it before it actually happens. I think in that data center where we had that 4-hour agreement, even though they were supposed to be there and replace stuff within 4 hours, we still had backup disks for maybe 95% of all the servers in the data center, and as soon as we got a predictive failure, we would replace it ourselves, and they would just send us a new disk. For the ones that we didn't have the backups, the one in the example from before, well then they would bring the disk out and replace it within those 4 hours. And with that, we are done with this lecture. I will see you in the next one.